Good evening and welcome to tonight's topic, which is about safety and security. Now, first of all, let me just say we are specifically talking about safety and security inside a children's ministry area, but there's a lot of overlap when you talk about all church security as well. And so we're going to jump right in to tonight's topic, but I do need to give just a statement right off the front. What we're going to talk about on safety and security, this is our opinion, so we're not telling you this is the way to do it. We want to give you ideas, things to get your thoughts to going, to help you to walk through your ministry and to evaluate, are we safe, are we secure? And so with that in mind, let's jump right in. Something I hear a lot of churches say, we're a small church, do we really need security? And what you're going to see is that there are a lot of things that can happen in a church of any size. Excuse me. So, with that in mind, let me share with you a couple of situations that I've seen. And this can happen in churches of any size because it doesn't have to do with the size of a church. It has to do with the culture that we're in, and that there's a lot of outside influences that can come in to what's happening. And so inside a church, I've seen a drunk person come inside the church while activities are going on. At a children's camp, I went to a camp and I noticed they had changed their security features. They'd installed video cameras so that they could see who was coming on and off of the campus at all times. And the reason they did that is because in the middle of one of their children's camp worship services, they had a person come in the front door, and it was during the song, and they had set up at the front a couple of candles. So the music's playing and there's candles up front, and this individual comes in, and they thought that the camp pastor had orchestrated this as a way of springboarding into the message. And so all of the leadership at the back, they're watching this man, and he walks up to one of the candles, and he stands there for a few minutes, and then he wanders over to another candle, and after about 2 minutes, the camp pastor came back and he said, "What's going on? Is this something you set up?" And it turns out this man had driven onto the children's camp property. He had parked behind the worship center. He was high and he was on drugs, and he had just come in and he had walked into the worship service, and they're all standing back there not reacting because they thought it was a drama. And so you can see from that, red flags flying everywhere. Where are there situations where somebody could enter your ministry and make it unsafe for the kids that you're trying to take care of, or interrupt your ministry, what's happening there? Another situation that we faced before is a custody situation. Sometimes there are custody things going on that you may not be aware of, even inside small towns. And so we had a situation where a dad came to pick up his daughter, and we knew because we had a check-in process. We knew when the mom checked her in, she specifically said that she had custody and her daughter was not supposed to go with the husband. And so when he came to check her out, we were able to step up very quickly and say, "Hey, because of what's going on, we can't release her to you." For one, he didn't have the parent name tag. And there's another advantage of a check-in, check-out system. We're going to talk a little bit about that in just a minute. Another situation that we had once, we locked down our children's area because we had a youth in our student ministry, and he was a guest. He had come, some things had happened, he got very upset, and he stormed out of the youth area. Well, that was enough for our security team to simply say, "Hey, we need to lock things down. We don't think there's a threat, but we need to be on the safe side." And so as you hear some of the suggestions we're going to make tonight, we want you to be thinking about, how can I live on the safe side? To keep my kids safe, to keep my ministry safe, but also sometimes to have the records in case somebody needs to look into what's happened in the past as well. Another situation that we had in the past was a predator. And this predator had been stalking a young lady and at our church, and came to church with the idea she won't be with her parents and I'm going to be able to get her alone. And so you've got to be careful of that. We've also had situations where in the state that we're in, a sexual offender has to have a pastor's permission before he can come to church. And it's the state's way of making sure that churches understand who is there. And so we've had on more than one occasion occasion a sexual predator who has come to church that did not do that. And the only reason they're not going to do that is because they have a bad motive. And so there's another situation. A situation that we faced as well was we had the grandson of a man who had owed a bunch of money, a lot of debt to the Russian mafia. And so we actually had the Russian mafia show up at church on a Sunday morning, and they came into our parking lot. Now, we were a larger church, and so we had a security team, and it didn't take our security team long to figure out we have a suspicious vehicle. They've been sitting in it since well before service, 2 men, and so they actually went and intercepted them before they even made it to the front door of the church. And but after they ran the license plate through our police department, they found out that those men were connected to the Russian mafia, and then later to find out that attending our church were the son and then his wife, and they were adults, and their grandchildren attended our church as well. But they had actually driven from another state to find family of the man who owned them money. Now, I just want you to picture for a second. That's not a situation, it sounds big, but it's not a situation that's limited to a church size. That's a situation that's limited to a culture and to simply the idea that it brought them to you. It didn't matter what size our church was. And so my point is, with listing these situations, if you think about it, any one of those situations can happen to a church of any size. Even having security for the idea that sometimes you may have a parent that gets upset over a situation, and sometimes it helps to have a presence right there, because we've all seen in Little League ball games and so forth, how sometimes situations can very quickly get out of hand, and that's not just limited to the secular world. That's come inside the church as well. Last, before we move on to 4 things we want to talk about, 4 areas where you want to be secure, is the last thing is simply this. I want you to evaluate your ministry and ask yourself the question, what are the potential dangers and threats that might come in here that we're not prepared for? And that's the key. It's the idea of you being prepared for whatever might happen. And so here are the 4 areas we're going to deal with. We're going to deal with facilities, with processes, with volunteers, and with your kids. And so let's just jump right into the first one. Let's talk about your facilities. And so first of all, I want you to walk through your facilities. Walk through, and I want you to look for any of the danger points that are in your facilities. For example, you might have a stage, a stage in one of your areas that has sharp corners. And so if kids were in there, if one were to trip or fall, I was at a church not long ago, and they were playing a game where kids were stepping from bucket to bucket, and they were right next to the stage. Now, that stage didn't have sharp corners, but it'd be very easy for people to be playing a game right next to an area where sharp corners are. Chalkboards, how sharp are the corners? I saw a kid cut his arm open because he was running and he caught his arm on that chalk tray to the chalkboard. Are your shelves wobbly? A lot of times children's ministries, because budget's tight, sometimes they'll use garage shelves, kind of that, PCV pipe. And there's nothing wrong with that, but you need to make sure it's secured to the wall. Because if a smaller child were to grab that and to pull, so you need to walk through what are the danger points inside the children's ministry, just having to do with the physical the elements that are in there. As you walk through also, look for the impression that you're going to make as well. And so as you're walking through, I went to a preschool not long ago, and inside the preschool, there was a big old water stain on the ceiling right above where the cribs were. And my first thought was, I can see a guest coming, newborn baby, first-time parent. They walk in, not just a first-time parent, but they walk in and they say, I'm not going to leave my child in here because that doesn't look safe to me. Or that shows signs of neglect. And if they're going to neglect that, what else might they be neglecting as well? With your preschool toys, do you have a system or a process of sanitizing them? We go through seasons where flu season, it's coming, and kids pass illness. What are you doing to keep your kids safe? When a child comes and has lice, do you have a process of letting other kids know who are in that Sunday school class, hey, this child, we found out later that this child had lice. We just want to let you know so that you can check your child. Or we found out a child in our children's ministry had chicken pox, found out Monday morning. And so what do? Well, you need to contact the parents of the kids who were in that class and say, hey, we had no idea, but it turns out Johnny over here had chicken pox. And so just want to let you know. So those are ways that you can keep safe as well. Now, that doesn't have to do with facilities. That's more process. So back to facilities, as you walk through, does every room have visibility? In other words, is there a window where somebody can look into every room? Is there a way that people can see what's happening inside that classroom? And that's very important. Also, is there a lock on every door? If we needed to lock down our children's area, would we be able to do that? And so we're going to talk about the importance of that in a few minutes when we get to some emergency procedures. There are a lot of churches that share areas, and so they'll have an area that they'll use for children's worship, and then they turn around, and maybe children's worship goes on during Sunday school time, and then in come preschoolers using the same area. Well, if you're doing that, you might have your kids doing a craft that uses small items that's a choking hazard for these kids coming in. So look at your facilities, look at how you're using your facilities. Are the windows in the doors? Do the doors have locks? Also, walk through from the idea of what is our fire escape procedure. If we have a tornado, what's our tornado procedure? And if we had an emergency situation, an intruder in our church, what would we do? Another question to ask, do we have enough exits? So as you look through your area, just be mindful of different danger points. Is it clean? Is it sanitary? What impression does it make? If you have windows, you also want to have window coverings. And again, I'll talk about that in just a second, because if there is an emergency situation where there's an intruder in your church, they are more likely to go through areas where they can see what's on the other side. And so you always want to have a way that you can cover that window in the door, where you can cover the windows, and we'll talk about that when we get to processes in just a second. In fact, let's just jump into processes. And so the first thing is, let's talk about emergencies. What are our processes? And so if there's a fire breaks out in your church, what's your process for getting your kids out of the church? Where do they go to? And then once they're there, how does your teacher make sure that he or she makes sure that they have everyone in their class? And so, in other words, what happens when people panic? Things get overlooked. And so you need to make sure that you train your volunteers every year with your emergency processes. And even if it's the same process, they might have switched rooms that they're in. And so, for instance, in one of our churches, our fire procedure was, if there's a fire, of course we had fire alarms, and that's one indicator. But also, if one of our leadership came to the door and said, we have a fire situation, our teachers would know the first thing they do is they line up all their students. Now, we always had more than one teacher in a classroom. That's another safety issue right there. Never have a teacher in a classroom alone for a variety of reasons. But one is an emergency. So why more than one teacher? Because you want one teacher to lead and you want another teacher to be the last one out. And so your class lines up. Nobody's panicking, but they line up. One teacher's at the front, one teacher's at the back. They walk out in a line to a designated area. Now, our area was far enough away from the building, but they weren't crossing a parking lot, because that's another danger. So as you map this out, you want to realize, while I'm taking my kids to be safe, I don't want to do anything that might cause more danger. And so we had a grassy area right outside our church, far enough away from the church that if emergency vehicles came, that we would not be in the way, our kids would be safe, but also it was the safest route to get them that distance away from the church. And then once they were there, our teacher would take a list, and it was a roll, and they would simply go down the list to make sure that every child was lined up, that nobody was left in the bathroom, that they didn't leave one back in the room that they didn't see, and that somebody didn't get lost on the way. And so another thing that we told our leaders is, while they're walking in that line, nobody leaves that line. Our process is, if a parent comes up and says, oh, we've got to go, no, we can't do that right now, not until we get to our safe zone. I'm very sorry, you can walk with us, but no children are going out of line. Because what you don't want to happen is, if you have, say, 3 teachers in a class of maybe 15, you don't want a parent to come grab Johnny and a parent come and grab Susie, and then you get out there and you're trying to remember which kids left. Okay, now the other question to answer is, how do they know who was in their classroom? One of our processes was when kids showed up. Now we had a check-in system. And so our check-in system, we knew who was in attendance. But if we had an emergency procedure, how are we going to that quickly digitally get all that information to all our teachers? Or how are we going to print it out? And then it's always changing because, somebody might come 15 minutes late. So the easiest way was simply for us to do a paper system. Even though we were taking attendance over here with our check-in system, that our teachers, they had a roll sheet. And they would, every week, they would check mark, every child that was there. And so if a teacher was teaching and a new child came, all the other teachers knew to go over, take that sheet. We had it with a magnetic clip. We had it right up next to the door. And so they would get it, simply mark it down. New guests were added. And it was also became a second way of making sure that all the guests that checked in through our digital system, we also had paper information as well, at least to say this guest was in this class. And so it was 2 benefits. It was the safety and security, and then it was also a double checking benefit. And so with the safety, on their way out, they grab that list. As soon as they get outside, they line up their class, they start calling the names that are checked off. That way they know that every child that was in my class this morning is safe and accounted for. They are all right here. And then leadership would be out there. If parents wanted to check people out, they would have to go through that leader, not through the teachers, through whichever leader was assigned to be out there to make sure that everybody's there. And so we had somebody over our teachers making sure that all the systems were working as well. So that was fire. Tornado, during springtime, we always had people, if there was bad weather, watching the weather to see what was coming, to get plenty of alert. And so if there was a tornado, and we've been through more than one, if there was a tornado, what we would do is we would simply move our kids to the areas in our church that had been designated as the safest areas for that kind of threat. And so a lot of times those are going to be your bathrooms, they're going to be inner hallways, places where there's no windows, okay, because you don't want glass. And so we had several. You want to make sure you have enough of those areas that on any given time, your maximum number of kids that they could fit there. So if your children's ministry, and I see a lot of churches, and they may have 12 in their children's ministry on Sunday morning, but on Wednesday night, they're feeding kids, and it's their big night, and they've got 60, 70 kids. Maybe they're even using vans to bring in kids. They have a lot more kids. Well, that's the number you want to use. So if there's a tornado, you're set up for the maximum number. So if your plan is, we're going to get them all in the bathroom, and your bathroom can fit 15 kids, and you've got 60, what are you going to do with the others? And then who's going to pick and choose who's safe and who's not? You see, when you map out your plan, you want to make sure you're planning for all the contingencies. And so with tornado, really not a lot more needs to be said there. So we're going to move to emergency intruder. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on that, but just enough to let you know. One is, if you have glass doors where people enter your children's area, you want to have some way to black those out. Blinds that come down, magnetic strips, like I said earlier, the windows in your children's ministry, you want to have a way to cover those. And what we used, our windows had a metal seal around them, and we took a piece of poster board and used magnets. It was cheap, inexpensive, very effective. Inside every classroom, we had a metal cabinet. And so all of our teachers knew that on the inside door of that cabinet was stuck that blind, is what we called it, the emergency blind. And then on the back side of the blind, not the magnet side, not the side an intruder would see, on the other side it had instructions as well. And so you take it, you put that up. I mean, it takes a few seconds, but then you're secure. Now, our emergency intruder procedure was essentially this. Now, we were, when we developed this, we were at a larger children's ministry, but I want you, I don't want size to interfere here. So I'm going to mention a few things that your church may not have, because I want you to simply see our process. And then you can take that process, and like what I said, I'm not saying this is how it needs to be done. I'm saying these are suggestions, these are opinions, and these are to get you to thinking. And so First of all, if there was an emergency situation, one of our leaders in our church or in our children's ministry would go room to room as soon as we knew that there was an emergency situation. And we were set up at our church. We had security teams. On any given Sunday, we had usually half a dozen marked security. They wore hats that said security, and then half a dozen that were not marked. And they would simply float through, look like everybody else, but they're watching for situations. Now, a lot of these were off-duty police officers. Some were former FBI, former military. They all had training, and then, of course, some were carrying it was obvious, and some was concealed. And so inside our church, we had a walkie-talkie system as well. So we would be notified quickly if in any area of our church something was to begin happening. And the first step is we need to lock down. Now, lockdown was simply, that means no one's in or out of our children's area. That's what it meant. The doors inside our children's area, they weren't locked yet. Okay, it's the first step. So we'd lock down, nobody in, nobody out. If somebody needs a child, then a leader outside that door is going to go get them and check them out. We're not letting anybody back. And now, if it went beyond that, if there was an emergency situation, a leader would go to each door, notify the teachers, because we did not have an intercom system. There was no way. I was at one church that was larger, and we did have an intercom system, and we had a coded message. So it was a message that everybody walking around, they would hear it. They would have no idea what it meant. And I don't remember what it was. I remember it was something that would never be said, but it wasn't so out of the norm that people would say, okay, what's that about? But it was something that all of our teachers knew, that if you hear this, it means we have an emergency situation and you need to go into that emergency procedure. Emergency procedure is this. They lock their door, because every door has a lock. They cover the window. Then they're going to move their children to an area, whatever area in the room that is least likely to be seen through that door or that window. And then they're going to turn out the lights, and they're going to keep the kids calm. And we would talk to them about, when you do this, you can have a flashlight in there. Have a flashlight, go into a very quiet time with your kids about, Psalm 56:3, when I am afraid, I will trust in you. The lights are out, the flashlight, either with a whisper, or if it's obvious that there's commotion in the hallway, then that's when you need to bring your kids to silence, total silence. And so you don't want to alarm your kids, you don't want to create a panic, but there are times where you might need to say, hey, for the next few minutes, until we know what's going on out there, nobody's going to make any noise. We're going to be quiet. We're going to be still. And then that door did not come unlocked. It didn't matter if a parent knocked at it. It didn't matter if I knocked at it. If they heard my voice on the outside of that door saying, open up, everything's okay. That was not the signal. There was one signal that if we ever went into this mode, and the signal was, and we worked it out with our local police department, is a police officer would slide his business card from that police department. He would slide it underneath the door, and that was the all clear signal. And so, in other words, once that door was locked, nobody else could get in, nobody else could get out. And we told our parents, every year we would do an orientation with our parents. We would not walk them through all the details, but would let them know if there ever was a fire, where to meet their kids, if there ever was, and that they couldn't take their kids out of line. And if there ever was an emergency intruder, that once that door's locked, their kids they're back there, and that nobody's going to open that door. And so do not stand outside the door banging, because all that's going to do is draw more attention. And so these are some things. Now, in situations, it's easy to plan a process. It is a lot more difficult to have people actually follow that process and not panic in the moment. And so I want to encourage you, come up with your procedure to keep your kids safe inside any emergency that you might face. And then that kind of depends on what region that you're in as well, the emergencies that might come your way. All right, we're going to jump over, a few more things. Processes, check in and check out. I thoroughly believe in a check-in and check-out system. You need to know which kids you have, who's back there. You need to make sure that who's picking them up is authorized to pick them up. We're just in a culture where it is very dangerous. And if you're very loosey-goosey, what happens if one of your kids disappears? And parents come and say, I can't find it. Where is he? And I've seen this happen, and a lot of times it was the kid hiding somewhere in the church. But it was eye-opening because the leadership realized we're not prepared. We don't have a process for this. There's lots of good check-in, check-out systems. We used to use Fellowship One. One of the things I liked about them is their payment, at least they used to do it, where their payment was tiered based on your church size. It's also a database, so there's a lot of other ways that you can use it as well. It is probably a little bit more on the expensive side. I don't know that for a fact. It's been a while since I looked into them. But it is one, but there's lots out there. But to have a good check-in, check-out system where you know who's there, you know who's supposed to pick them up. If there's a situation with a child during the worship service, you have a way to red flag that that adult. Sometimes people will put up a parent code on the screen, we tell our parents to watch for these. If it's a smaller church, a lot of times you know where they sit, and so it's easy to slip in and ask them to come out. A little more disruptive, but it does work that way as well. With check-in and check-out systems, I will say there's a few downfalls. And the downfalls really come with how people use them. And so a lot of adults, they'll want to let their kids go and the kids check themselves in. Well, as soon as a child is checked in, they need to come back to the children's area. Because what happens if they check in and then they run off and then they don't come back and the system says you have them, but they've never even stepped foot back there. And I've seen that with several situations where the system says somebody's checked in because, either they checked in and they left or I'll come back later, but they really weren't back there and they never were. And where's the liability? If, say, somebody were to kidnap that child and your system says they have you and the parents, where are they? And so a lot of the failings come with how they're used or misused, with sometimes parents not wanting to actually take their child there, parents not wanting to keep up with the parent name tag. And in fact, I'll say with security, the greatest issues I've ever had with security came from parents inside the church not wanting to follow the process. And how I would have to look at them and what I would have to say is simply this. I understand it's a little inconvenient on your part, but you are thinking of your convenience and you are thinking about the safety of your one child. But I'm responsible for the safety of all of these children. And for us to keep them safe, then we have to have these processes in line. And nothing may happen today, but it's for that day when something does happen that our kids are safe and that our kids are protected and that everything's in place that you would want us to have in place. And so sometimes there has to be an education process, especially if you're initiating it and your parents are not used to this. You will get questions, why do we need this? And at that point, the greatest thing that can help you is to share stories of them from other churches, whether they were prepared or not prepared. This is why we're getting ready, because we have a priority to keep our kids safe. All right, we're going to move on just a little bit. Let's talk about volunteers. One way to keep your kids safe, you've got to check your volunteers. Now, Saddleback, I don't know if they use it anymore. They used to have a saying in their children's ministry, and it was this. It was, in God we trust, screen everybody else. In other words, we trust God. No offense, we need a background check on you. And so all of your adults, age 18 and older, you need to have a background check on them. Now, there's several systems you can run them through. And as you look into these systems, you want to make sure that it's going to be run on a state level and a federal level, because the two don't always have the same information. And so find a good background check system. And it does cost $5, $7 per volunteer. But that is a very important piece of paper that says this person does not have a criminal background. This person does not, it walks through all the different safety features. But I also want to say this. I see a lot of churches, and they put a lot of stock in those background checks. And there's nothing wrong with that unless you do it without the mindset that a background check is only going to catch offenders who have already been caught. In other words, a background check is not going to catch anybody, a pedophile or a molester who has never been caught. And they say statistically that a sex offender has committed over 100 acts before they're caught. And so there's a big wide open gap where even with background checks, you need to put other features in place. One is, how do you choose your volunteers? Well, here's a great way to choose them. Okay, don't ever choose warm bodies. Don't ever manipulate. At some point, we'll do a session on volunteers. Don't ever manipulate volunteers to be a part of your ministry. And so here's what you want to do. You want to find volunteers who are willing, who are godly. Who are trainable, and who share your vision. That's what you're looking for in volunteers. And then every year, do a background check on every one of them. Every year, keep it current. I think at one of our churches, we did it every 18 months. And I think it was just budget. And 18 months, that's reliable enough is what we had been told. But you want to keep it consistent. We set reminders. We'd get a reminder. So-and-so's background check is due. And if you do it all during an orientation at the beginning of the year, it's a whole lot easier. That way it's not through the year. Oh, I need to get your background check. Oh, you forgot it. I forgot it too. Then 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 8 weeks passes. And you do it during orientation. During that orientation, do training. There you can do all the emergency processes, all the other processes. Oh, by the way, in processes, I did not mention. You want to make sure you have a process for discipline, and you keep records. So if a child's been in trouble, if they've done something, you want to keep a record of that. And sounds almost bad, keep a record of their wrong, but you want a record of it. And then you also need incident reports, which is if a child gets hurt, hits their head, falls down, whether they end up going to get stitches or whether it was just a bump on the head. If it was bad enough for them to get a Band-Aid, to go to the office, get an ice pack, you need to write up an incident report. That way, if you ever need that information, it's right there and it's easy access. And it's not, oh, do you remember? I don't remember. That was so long ago. And so you need to keep records of those as well. All right, with your volunteers, get a background check. During the orientation, give them your expectations. Now, that's not just, hey, I expect you to be in class before the kids get there. That's not just, I expect you to have your lesson prepared. That's also, we can't have kids sitting on your lap. And kids are going to love you and they're going to want to sit on your lap. But in our culture, that's just inappropriate. And so, if a kid sits on your lap, just stand up, give them the chair. And you can stand or find another chair. Kids that are clingy, remember we talked about the power of a high five. It helps draw a boundary. That was in a previous session, I believe, on discipline. And then give your sponsors life conduct expectations. Now, we really shouldn't have to do this, but basically it's a code of biblical living. To say, hey, if you're going to lead our kids, we want to make sure that you're living a life that's consistent with the things that you're teaching. And of course, go over your emergency processes too. You might talk to them about side hugs. That's so much better than a front hug. And then, and it's sad you have to say this, but you may need to tell your leaders, hey, inappropriate. Make sure you don't do anything that has the appearance of inappropriateness. I was at a camp where a sponsor kissed a kid. And now, he was joking when he did it. She was close family friends, but it caused a huge trauma at that camp. A lot of drama and a lot of trauma. And it was a situation that followed them back home as well. And it all would have been avoided if he would have used the common sense, hey, this is not appropriate for me to do right here. This is not appropriate, for me to kiss this little girl, and so anyway, a lot of things that you want to think through with your leaders. What are the boundaries? And some of it you may need to talk over as a church and make some decisions there as well. And so we've talked about facilities, we've talked about processes, we've talked about volunteers, and then last of all, let's talk about kids, because we also need to keep kids safe from kids. Now, depending on your situation, it's not always that big of a deal. It may be, in your situation, it might be as simple as, we have rules, and one of our rules is, hey, you don't ever take scissors and threaten someone else. You want to have rules, and you want to have a discipline process, and you want to let your kids know what you expect, and you don't have to go through everything like, don't ever threaten with scissors. No, treat others right. And so have rules that are established that cover all those generalities. Now, inner city, I used to have kids that they were into all sorts of things. and second grader assaulting, another child in the neighborhood with a baseball bat. And so if you have situations like that, you may need to address them in a little bit of a different way. But you want to have processes for all four of these. For your facilities, how do we keep kids safe with our facilities, the physical structure? How do we keep safe through our processes? Check in, check out, in emergencies, with discipline, incidents. How do we keep kids safe? How do we keep kids safe with volunteers? And it's a two-way street. You're also keeping your volunteers safe because it only takes one lie that can damage a person's reputation and create a lot of grief and hardship. That's why you need those windows. We never have a volunteer in a room with kids by himself. We never have a volunteer that is not visible what's going on. Even in counseling situations, men really need to talk with the boys, ladies with the girls. It all needs to be visible. You just need to be very careful inside your process. So you want to keep your volunteers safe as well as keeping your kids safe. And, of course, we talked about background checks there as well. Talked about kids, establishing rules. Last thing I want to say is get outside opinions. Have some other people outside of your church come walk through your children's area. Let them point out the things that maybe you're so used to seeing that you don't notice anymore. And there's been several churches that ask us to come in, and really it wasn't evaluating their children's area, that was part of it, but it was evaluating what a guest experiences when they come to their church. And, a couple of these churches were rather large. One was a church of about 2,000. And when we went to the church, we just walked in as guests. Because beforehand, I had one education minister. He said, now when you come, be sure you park. I said, no, don't tell me, because I want to have the full guest experience. And so got there. Does the signage tell me where to park? Can I see where the children's area is? Inside the children's area, do I know where to go? Can I find my way? How am I greeted? Does somebody walk me through? Do they show me the children's area? Do I know how to pick kids up, how to check them in? All the questions that guests ask. And so that's a little different than what we're talking about today. But having that outside opinion, if you're going to bring a guest in and look at your children's ministry, you might have them do that too. And then be very aware as you go through and you have people give their opinions. Don't let it hurt your feelings. They may have some very straightforward things to say, and all of it, like this video, it's opinion. But be mindful that to bring in people with good hearts who really want to help you. One final thing, and I can't believe I almost left this off my list. Do you know what the most dangerous part of your church is? Now, I'm pausing for a minute. That's dramatic effect right there. The most dangerous part of your church are the bathrooms that are closest to your children's area. Because if a pedophile comes in and they're looking for an opportunity, that's where they're going to go. And so as you have people walk through, take a look at the bathrooms. In the churches that I went to, that's one of the things that I did. I would slip out during the worship service and I would walk to the children's area. And in some large churches that I've been to, I walked into the children's area. There was nobody there. Nobody there to ask me who I was. One of them, there were leaders in the hallway, and they saw me, and I just smiled and walked on past. Nobody asked what I was doing there. No, I could have been anybody. In one of the churches, I walked through a whole education wing, and there was nobody there. And I told him later, I said, you got a lot of equipment back here that could walk out. You've got so many exits in this building. There was nobody there, and it was between the worship center and their children's area. And so bringing somebody in just to kind of look around to give you that guest experience, very helpful. Take a look at your bathrooms, though. The best way is to have bathrooms that are in your children's area that adults don't use. And that way, those bathrooms are for children, and there's an adult leader standing outside while so-and-so is going to the bathroom, or they're taking them in groups to the bathroom as well. But you want to keep your kids safe. Watch those bathrooms. It is the most dangerous place in probably our American churches today. And so this whole session has been about safety and security. I hope my goal was, and I hope I've done this, was to give you things to think about that will help your church to be more safe inside your children's area, to keep your kids safe. And lastly, I want to mention, we have resources, 330resources.org. It's 330resources.org. children'sministry.org, and all sorts of resources to help your children's ministry, to help your church. Got resources for youth and pastors and all sorts. And so go check those out when you get a chance. You can also go to our main website, and it's 330ministries.org. It's all spelled out, THREE, 330ministries.org. And of course, you can go to our store just by pushing store at the top. We've got resources on there, all sorts of free family information. And so all that's there to help you. If there's other ways that we can help you, let us know. Feel free to ask us your questions. We're here for you. We're glad to help any way we can. Hope you have a great day, and God bless you. Goodbye.